So for those just joining us, we'll get started in just a few minutes.
Good morning. Can I ask something from yesterday?
Sure.
What is the dual coding?
Yeah, she just wanted everyone.
Dual coding is a concept that we take in information from two primary sources as we learn, visual and auditory. And so to best enhance learning, what we do is we try to divide the material up and so that it fills the visual content, the auditory content, and that way we can provide more material for students to learn. They can learn better than if we were to provide information in one primary way, such as through lecture or through all images, if that's possible. So that's dual coding.
Wouldn't video fulfill that condition, having a visual and an auditory?
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
So for those just joining us, we'll get started with the presentation in about a minute. Just waiting for folks to come on. And so just a minute more. Okay, I think we have a good crowd here, so let's get started. I will let our friends from University of New Hampshire introduce themselves again today. I hope that you were able to see the presentations yesterday, but if not, these are all recorded and I will be putting them out on our Assignment Initiative YouTube channel. So if you missed yesterday's, don't worry. But today's I'm expecting to be super interesting, and I'll let Victor take over from here.
Thanks, Erin, and thanks everybody for being here. And much of what I'm going to talk about today will be in the context of what was presented yesterday. In other words, I'm not going to redo the presentation from yesterday because I'll eat up my whole hour doing that. And many of you were there yesterday as well. So, but I will make some references just to provide a little context where it's necessary. So what I'm going to focus on is some research presentations about the Student Cognition Toolbox, and the focus is going to be on establishing the validity or the internal validity of the instructional tool, which is the Student Cognition Toolbox. And you know, in research on validity, there are many kinds, but there are two kinds of validity that are often spoken about. One of them is internal validity, and that is, you know, does the instrument, does the tool, does the measure, what, you know, the construct, whatever it is you're focusing on, does it actually tap what it is you purport that it measures or taps? So if you have a test of introversion, say a personality test of introversion, you know, internal validity would have to do with whether or not, in fact, the measure that you've created taps that dimension. So we're sort of borrowing from test measurement theory and research in this regard. The other kind of validity that's really important is what's called face validity. In other words, does the measure look like what you would think it would look like if in fact it was measuring? You know, so for example, if you were measuring introversion, you probably wouldn't ask questions about whether or not you like to see dairy cows on the side of the road when you go on your Sunday drive. I mean, maybe there's something about that. People that do that are introverted, but it doesn't look like it. So hopefully we've established yesterday that the Student Cognition Toolbox has face validity. I mean, it looks like a measure that taps student learning strategies and study skills. So just a quick set of acknowledgments here again. Here's the Student Cognition Toolbox team that Kathy mentioned yesterday, and many of us are still around and a few of us have moved on to other ventures. But in addition, I want to make sure that I recognize the Davis Educational Foundation. And the foundation has actually supported this work, the Student Cognition Toolbox, but has actually supported our work over the last decade. So all of the work that we've done on cognition and learning has been supported by the Davis Educational Foundation, and we're obviously and eternally grateful to them. At UNH, our work has been supported by the Office of Academic Affairs and Provost Office. They've supported this project and of course all of the work of the Center for Excellence in Innovation in Teaching and Learning at UNH. And obviously and critically, we thank the faculty and students who have worked with us on the many projects that we've been doing on the Student Cognition Toolbox. And last but not least, as Kathy mentioned yesterday, we thank the colleagues and collaborators at Carnegie Mellon University with the work we've done, and to say that we couldn't have done it without you is an understatement. So we designed the Student Cognition Toolbox with the following potential assessments in mind. And so we wanted to measure students' learning of the Student Cognition Toolbox content. That's one of the goals we had. We wanted to measure students' confidence in their ability to use the strategies that are covered in the Cognition Toolbox, which were mentioned yesterday: spacing and interleaving and space practice and worked examples and elaboration and self-explanation and so on. And we also wanted to measure the likelihood that students would use these strategies. It's one thing that you have this great tool that instructs students on cognitively based study strategies. It's a related but different question is, are they likely to use these? I'm going to say something about prior research on that topic. We also asked students in this work to describe an example of how they might use the strategies that they're learning about. And that has to do with planning. And again, that word planning is one that I'm going to bring up again. So we developed the Student Cognition Toolbox really, as either I mentioned or Catherine mentioned yesterday, really began to do it a decade ago with a low-tech version actually deployed through PowerPoint presentation. And over the years, we began to crystallize what we thought the important components were that needed to be in a tool if we developed a more robust tool like we're doing here in collaboration with CMU. That work we did was informed by our reading of research and our own thinking about what would be needed to develop not only a valid but an effective instructional tool. It turns out that just not too long ago, Mark McDaniel and Giles Einstein published a theoretical framework in the Association of Psychological Science journal on pretty much the same stuff that we've been doing. So what they did is they did, first of all, a review of the literature. And what they found was that a lot, in fact, most of the efforts to instruct students on using appropriate cognitively based study strategies showed that although you could instruct students in using these techniques, and if the students use them on an experimental task, usually in a laboratory, is that students would perform well relative to a control condition, a control group. That's great. But what they also found in their review of the literature is that what we're really interested in is transfer. Will students transfer the skills that they've learned to tasks beyond the one that's tapping their learning within the context of an experiment? And what they found was that the results of many, many studies, dozens of studies, and it's a beautiful article to read to get an overall view of this area, is that it was pretty disappointing that a lot of the research, in fact, much of the research showed that you didn't get the kind of spontaneous transfer or far transfer that we're looking for. And what they came up with is a model. And they reviewed the literature to see what constructs or components were associated with effective transfer. And what do you need in order to get far transfer? And what they came up with, number one, is knowledge. Is that obviously, is if students are going to learn and spontaneously apply cognitively based study strategies, they have to know what the cognitively based study strategies are and how they work. They need to know the content. Well, that's an important component. In the Student Cognition Toolbox, of course, what we do is we measure their learning of the content two ways, two direct ways. One is we have learned by doing activities that are formative in nature. They get feedback, they can go in and change things and so on, try again, you go back, look at the material. And then the other measure of content are the checkpoint quizzes that were referred to yesterday. These are, of course, scored quizzes. There are different modalities. You can do one attempt, you can do multiple attempts, and so on. We have one attempt. So that's the first component in McDaniel and Einstein. The second one is belief. They talk about belief is that, okay, you learn the stuff, you learn the good cognitive skills. You have to believe that if you use them, you would be able to be effective in learning new academic material. You have to believe that you've learned the skills that will lead to effective learning. Well, in the Student Cognition Toolbox, at the end of each module, we ask students the extent to which they believe that they have learned the skill needed to apply the technique, the study strategy. So right there on both of these, the Student Cognition Toolbox and Mark and Giles' model line up perfectly. Number three, they say you have to be committed. So you've learned the material, you believe that if in fact you applied the technique, that it would be effective, that you have the skill. And then third, you have to actually be committed. You have to believe, or you have to be committed as, okay, I think I'm gonna do this. I know I can do it. Will I do it? We operationalize that is in every module. We have a measure of their likelihood, the self-reported likelihood that they will use the strategy that's taught in that unit, either in the course in which they're enrolled right now, when they're completing the SCT, and in future courses. So there we go, we're 3 for 3. And then finally, last but not least, and Kathy learned this over a decade ago when she developed her first PowerPoint slides, you not only need to teach them what the good stuff is, you not only need to get them to believe that they can do it, you not only need to get them to say, I will do it, I'm committed, but they need to have a plan. They need to know, like, how will you operationalize putting this into practice? And what McDaniel and Einstein say, their fourth component, is planning. At the end of each of our modules, and at the end, is that we ask students to describe an example of how they might use the strategy taught in that module, either in this course or in the summary module in future courses that they might take. So it turns out that the review of their literature, where they found that you need to know the stuff. You have to believe that you can do the stuff. You have to be committed to do the stuff, and you have to have a plan to do the stuff. It turns out that, I mean, it is fortuitous. I mean, maybe not so much because we were reading the same literature that they were, but it's a beautiful mapping, and we're so delighted that this has occurred. This is relatively new that this article came out. So in the work that I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about the source of the data. So we have three components that we're going to talk about. We have background data, through our IRB for the students that agree, we're able to get SAT scores. We're able to get a measure of their academic self-efficacy, their more recently, their need for cognition, and their test anxiety. We have an academic assessment battery that we administer, that Lauren handles, that we administer before students complete the Student Cognition Toolbox. So we have other background data. We have, high school rank, and we have self-reported gender and self-reported ethnicity, things that are in the UNH student database. But this is what I'm talking about here. Self-efficacy, academic self-efficacy here has to do with, in a general way, do students believe that they have the skills to perform a certain kind of task? And we have a measure that we developed that taps that. Need for cognition, this is a measure that was developed many decades ago now, I think in the 80s even, by Cacioppo and Petty, that people vary in how much they feel they need to think, to cognate, to abstract. And as you might imagine, there are some people that are very cognitive in their approach and desire, and there are others that are less so. This is a measure that we started measuring last spring. And then finally, test anxiety. This is a particular measure. We can put references to each of these if anybody is interested. Basically, it measures, it's a general and often reported measure of test anxiety. And then we also have data within the Student Cognition Toolbox. And Lauren and Kathy both talked about many sources of data that we have. Today, we're going to talk some about the study behavior inventory. This was the pre-test that was given before students did the modules, and then the post-test, and it measures the extent to which on the pre-test they report having used what we call deep cognitive processing versus more shallow, like underlining, highlighting. Deep processing might be trying to relate what you are learning now to what you already know, to synthesize material, etc. In addition, the OLI has built into it the checkpoint quizzes, and we're going to report some results based on checkpoint quizzes. There's a checkpoint quiz in each of the modules for the content, the 6 study strategies. We now, in the summary one in the fall, we have like a cumulative final exam, as it were, that measures their learning of the whole module. But from spring and last year, we don't have that. So in each module, there'll be a checkpoint quiz score, and we average those over the 6 content modules. We also have overall mean confidence ratings for use in 6 of the study strategies. We have those data for the spring. So this is self-efficacy, but it's self-efficacy specifically within the context of, do I believe I have the skills to do what I just learned in that module? Whereas the self-efficacy measure over here in background is a more general measure. And then finally, and not least, we also have data external. We also have data external to the Student Cognition Toolbox. Remember from yesterday, all of the students are in an academic course in which they complete the Student Cognition Toolbox. So we get the background data from, wherever Elizabeth gets that. with IRB approval. We have all the data, some from the analytics download, some we can get from the grade book, from within OLI, and all of these students are taking exams in the course in which they're enrolled on the content of their courses. So those are our sources of data. So we have, as we mentioned yesterday, for the fall of 19 and the spring of 2020, we had, I'm doing this from memory, of maybe something like 900 and some in the fall and another 1,200 or something, or 1,300 in the spring. This fall, we have a lot more. We don't have those data analyzed yet. But I'm going to focus for the purpose of this on just 2 courses rather than all the data. And the main reason is that we're going to look at exam scores. And if we have like 20 courses that we're working with, they're all giving exams, but they're not the same exams. So we can't really properly do across all the courses analyses that try to predict exam score, because the exam scores are just totally unrelated and based on the content. So within the introductory psych course from the fall of 2019 and the intro biology course from spring of 20, we have sufficient data to do some analyses. So our first research question has to do with, did students' reports of intended study behavior change after engaging in the SCT? You remember yesterday, everybody takes the SCT at the beginning before they do any student cognition toolbox. And then in the final summary module, could be a week later or whatever, whenever they're done, they complete the post measure. The pre-measure asks them to what extent they've used the different study strategies that are represented in the 16, well, in the 14 item in the fall and in the 16 item measure in the spring. And the post student behavior inventory measures their intended use going forward. So before I show you any results for everything today, I want to say something which we all know to be true, which is to say correlation does not equal causation. In this initial work that we're doing, we're not doing experiments on the Student Cognition Toolbox. And the reason for that, we didn't just dive in and start manipulating variables, is we have to establish that we have a tool that has both face validity. Does it look like, you know, when people look at it, they'll go, or students look at it and go, yeah, I think this, I'm learning about study strategies. That's important. And number 2, that the tool behaves the way it ought to behave in relation to other variables. And so we have to first establish that kind of internal validation. So we're doing that through correlational kinds of analyses, in the sense we're not manipulating variables. We already, and we're going to talk about some of those plans, but if we've said that this variable should be correlated with this variable, like scores on the CheckPoint quiz ought to be correlated with their exam scores in the course, and they're not, we got a problem, right? There's a problem. So we're trying to document the plausibility of a causal explanation through correlational analyses. So if we find the correlations are present, that gives us hope that if we do the right kind of experiment where we manipulate the variables, we'll be able to establish in a causative way. But right now, we need to demonstrate that the correlations show up the way we expect them to, because if they didn't, we're in trouble. Okay. So we're trying to validate the tool. So just what would we expect? We would expect that after students go through the Student Cognition Toolbox, that, yeah, I know. I'm looking at Gloria. You have to turn up the thing. This has something to do with the new version of Excel, Kathy tells me, that it's hard to get it on the angle, but we're going to work on that. These are the 8 deep study strategies. And these are the pre-SBI, Student Cognition Toolbox averages over all of the students completed the toolbox in the spring of 2020. So what would we expect? We would expect that after they went through and learned all this good cognitive stuff, that they ought to report using more, that they intend to use more of those strategies going forward. And in fact, wait a minute, sorry. In fact, that's what we found. So these error bars here are confidence intervals, 95% confidence intervals. The clear bars are the pre-scores. The darker ones are the post. And what you can see literally for each of them, there is an increase. If you average these over the 8 items and do a pre to post t-test between them, you get a huge whopping t-value with a pretty substantial effect size. And you can get an idea that if you look at those 95% confidence intervals, I don't think the lower bar of the top one overlaps with the higher bar of the pretest in any instance. So there you go. So that gives us, some hope. Okay, now whether or not these scores relate to anything else is another matter, but we do see a shift, which is what we'd expect. Now, here are the averages for the 8 shallow strategies. So, if you look at the first one, if I have difficulty, I go right to the instructor. I focus my attention on studying right to the exam, before the exam, cramming. I copy my lecture notes, right, verbatim kind of thing. I reread, I highlight, I organize my notes, all right? These are the shallow ones. So these are pretty high, and we generally find those are higher than we would want them to be. We want them to come down. Remember, we told you yesterday, in the fall of 19, our first effort, major effort, we found virtually no shift from the pre to the post, virtually none. Those means were right on top of each other, which then, as Lauren talked about, that was some of the iterative improvement. We went in and made some of those many student wonders modules, components, to really focus on, a lot of students say, why shouldn't I cram before exams? Or why shouldn't I highlight my material? Or what do you mean I shouldn't reread the material over and over again? That kind of thing. So we made some changes. So we were hoping that what we would see is that, unlike in the fall of 19, we didn't see much of a dip. In the spring, when we actually beefed that up, we would see that. Well, we're going to see what happens here. So let's just start over to the 2 at the left here. Notice the big dip. What are those 2? The first one is about asking the instructor. We really hit that hard in the spring version. And then the second one is we have a whole module that's focused on the value of spacing out your study, and we highlight that in relation to you should do it this way and not cram it. And even though cramming might help in the short run, it sure doesn't help in the long run. We're going to skip this little puppy here for the minute, but for the last 4, what you notice is we don't see much change. In fact, we see no systematic change. The one we see the big change on here right in the middle has to do with reading the material more than once. And we see an increase there now. We don't know what's going on there. I mean, what might be going on is students think is, I should be doing all these good things that I've been learning about. Obviously, rereading the material is a good thing. We told them that reading is good, you need to read, but rereading over and over again. So we may need to go look in to our content to see if we didn't emphasize enough that if you reread, it needs to be in association with, you mentioned yesterday a technique about reading, Aaron. So anyway, this is our results. Is there a relation between students' individual differences in background and their scores on the checkpoint quizzes? Okay, and here, what we're going to do is we're going to just focus on the relative self-efficacy, the verbal SAT, and the test anxiety. And each of these correlations, we're going to show you for intro psych and for biology. And in some ways, the correlations are comforting. So for the intro psych course, what we see is a small, modest, but positive correlation with this relative self-efficacy measure and their performance on the checkpoint quizzes. But remember, the self-efficacy measure that they did before they started any of this didn't ask them about how they were going to do on the Student Cognition Toolbox measures. It asked them how they thought they were going to do in the course. Now, I don't report it here, but in every study that we found, when we correlate this self-efficacy measure with their overall academic performance in the course, we find more substantial correlations. So the fact that the correlation is less is actually pretty encouraging. Albert Bandura says, he developed this idea of self-efficacy, is that if you don't have a good match between what the efficacy is about and the outcome measure, the correlations will be weaker. So it's actually okay. The verbal SAT is an interesting measure. We've got these data, verbal SAT and exam performance in courses for many semesters, over dozens of courses. And the correlations between verbal SAT and exam performance, depending on the courses, are anywhere from about 0.3. 0.3 is about the lower end, and 0.5. They're quite substantial. It's probably not surprising because many exams are based on reading books and articles and things like that. The SAT verbal is a measure of reading comprehension. So the fact that we have a beefier correlation for the verbal SAT is, encouraging. The negative small correlation with text anxiety, my view is that that's encouraging, because what it's suggesting is that whether students are relatively low or high on test anxiety, and we have a broad range of scores. In other words, we have a nice normal distribution of scores where some students are very low on test anxiety, some are very high, and most more to the middle. Is that what this is showing is there's a negative correlation, but it's pretty piddly. Is that students that are relatively high or low on test anxiety are just as likely to score one way or another on the checkpoint quizzes. So that's encouraging. If we had a strong negative correlation, we'd probably want to do an intervention to try to ameliorate their anxiety for completing the Student Cognition Toolbox. Just for replication here, there is the results for the biology course. All right, pretty good. Is there a relation of between the measures within the SCT? Right, we have some correlations of background measures and performance in the SCT. But now we want to know is within the SCT, do the variables behave with regard to each other the way we might expect if we had a valid tool? So I'm going to focus on two measures within the Student Cognition Toolbox. One is the post-instruction study behavior inventory scores and the checkpoint quizzes. Okay, I'm looking at my clock to make sure I'm on here. Okay, introductory psychology for the fall. All right, what we did was we took the checkpoint quiz scores for each of the 6 content modules, and we got the average checkpoint quiz score across those 6. What we did is a median split, and we took The lower half, the median and below, called them relatively low performers on the checkpoint quizzes, and above the median, relatively high. It's a relative measure. And then what we did was we looked at their post-instruction deep processing scores. So what would we expect is if this has internal validity. If students did the Student Cognition Toolbox and learned it really well, they should report more deep intention, right? To use deep processing. If they didn't learn it as well, they didn't learn the good stuff as well, then we would expect them to report less intended use. All right, again, it's not causation, but if it doesn't show that, we got a problem on our hands. By the way, this is something that Catherine and I worked on yesterday. I had all these fancy regression coefficients and controlling for this and that. And if you're into that stuff, it's okay. But we wanted to try to do something more visual. So we're doing sort of high-low splits. And, you know, I know the statisticians say, oh, you shouldn't be, you know, you're going to throw away all the variance in the data. We have those regressions and they work nicely. Thank you. But here's just a little pictorial. Does the behavior go the way we want it? And the answer is yes. So here's the relatively high people on the checkpoint quiz. Here's the people relatively low. Remember the the study behavior inventory has a 6-point scale. These are the averages across the 8 deep processing items. And what you see, this is the, oh, I got a standard error there. It would be a little bit wider if it were confidence interval. But as you can see is that the students who did better on the checkpoint quizzes reported more intended use of deep processing. Not causation, but good news. All right, so that's from, by the way, if anybody wants to see an ANOVA table, there it is. By the way, that's the F value for the high-low split on check. So there's an F of 5.16 and a P of 3, basically. If you want that, you can get the slides and look at it. Okay, that was intro psych. Here's biology. So we want replication. Do we find the same thing in both courses? By the way, we can do this, and we will, for virtually all the courses we've examined, but just showing you these as illustrative. And we didn't cherry pick these. We decided to do intro psych and biology because they had good ends over 100. So that's why we did that. So here's now the biology course, exactly the same setup. The students that scored relatively high on the checkpoint quiz scored substantially higher on the deep processing items, post-instruction. Again, standard error bar. So again, good news. So there's a measure within, there's our ANOVA table, nice big F there. There's no such thing as a P of 0, but that's the way SPSS does it. The probability of the outcome is 0. No, it's not. It's something less than 1. All right. So our next and final research question in this validation effort is there a relationship between exam scores, right, a measure outside of Student Cognition Toolbox, and measures within the Student Cognition Toolbox? So we have, once again, the checkpoint quizzes, and then this other measure, which I'll tell you about, that I referred to briefly before, of confidence. All right. So in the intro psych class, we again had our students broken up into students that scored relatively high or relatively low on the checkpoint quiz. And now, as the dependent measure, instead of deep study strategies, right? Now we're seeing how did they do on, in this case, exam 2. Remember from the fall, I mentioned this yesterday, there was an exam before they did the Student Cognition Toolbox. And that had to do, we weren't ready to deploy it quite ready. So we waited for everybody to have an exam. They did the Student Cognition Toolbox, and then there's a second exam. So this is how students did on the second exam based on how they did on the checkpoint quizzes. And there is the result. So here are the students that are relatively high. Why am I, there's my cursor, relatively high on the checkpoint quiz. These are the students that are relatively low based on the median split. And here is their exam performance. So just to give you an idea here, look at this. Students who had done well on the checkpoint quizzes on exam 2, they got about 82% correct. For the students that were relatively low on the checkpoint quizzes, they got about a 68. Correlation does not mean causation. On the other hand, if we saw no difference on the exam performance as a function of how well they learned the stuff we wanted them to learn and then apply, we'd have problems on our hands. Now we're going to do experiments to demonstrate that there is a causative factor, but this is good news. So this is good news. By the way, remember in the fall, there was an exam 1. So what we did do was we did an analysis of covariance where we controlled for everybody's exam 1 performance. They do the SCT, and then we have exam 2. And so here you'll see exam 1. So when by the way, the correlation between exam 1 and exam 2 is about 0.7. Students who do well continue to do well. But what we're doing by the covariance is we're basically equating everybody to 0 and then looking at the exam 2 controlling for their initial performance. So again, we see a whopping F value here for that group. In intro biology, 140 students. Again, we have the checkpoint quizzes, low and high, and we have exam 1. Now in this course, the students did the first exam after. There was no exam before. And lo and behold, we find that students that scored high on the checkpoint quizzes score significantly and substantially higher on their first major exam than if they were relatively low. We have all kinds of other regression analyses where we control for their pre-SBI scores and their SATs and so on. But for our purposes today, we just want to show some simple, direct analyses that hopefully that the results behave the way they should if there was a causal relation. So it's a plausibility kind of analysis. All right, the final one analysis is, in our biology course last spring, we, at the end of every module, we got a one item measure of confidence. And at the, you can see is the students answered, I am blank % confident that I am able to appropriately apply this strategy in my future studies. That's what academic self-efficacy is. It's not that I believe I'm going to do it. That's commitment. It's not that I'm confident that I would do well. It's that I believe that I have the skill to do the task correctly. So we asked them at the end of each content module, and we got an average across the 6 content modules. And then what we did, you can see up here, same thing we did with checkpoint quiz. We did a median split. So we did a frequency distribution. Everybody at and below the median on confidence went into the relatively low confident group, and everybody that was above the median were in the high confident group. So we have 2 groups, low and high, relatively low and high. And what we want to see is how did they do on the experiment? How did they do on the exam as a function of their self-efficacy? And here we go. And that's the result. So students who on the self-efficacy measure taken when they were working in the self-efficacy mini course, the students that were more confident that they learned the stuff, they knew how to do it, and they could succeed, when they got to the exam, they did significantly and substantially better than students who had low self-efficacy. It's an important result, really important result, showing that one's belief in one's ability to perform the task at hand predicts how they will do the task at hand. We've got experiments in mind where we're going to manipulate self-efficacy. There are interventions that you can do that boost up self-efficacy. And so we can, if we can experimentally boost it up and then see that the performance on the exams is higher than if we don't boost it up, now we're getting at causation. But this is a plausibility analysis, and it is encouraging. Now, there's the analysis of variance table and the F value and so on. Now, what I want to do, I have two brief more slides, but we have time, I think, so I wasn't going to show this to you. It looks busy, but I think it will be good. So what I just showed you was that if students were relatively high in their confidence, they did better on the exam than if they had low. And that's true. But we could go a little bit further. And this is an informative analysis. So what we did, remember we did that median split on checkpoint quiz performance. So down, I have a 0, 1 there instead of high and low. But students, there we go. What happened? There we go. So do you see the slides?
Yes, we do.
Okay, good. I lost it there for a while. Is that over to the right there where the 1 is, those are students who have scored relatively high on the checkpoint quizzes. And the 0 on the left is students who scored relatively low on the checkpoint quizzes. And then the bars, the dark and the light, are the ones that were high in confidence or low. So, all right, so let's look at the right side. Overall, the students that scored better on the exam, over here to the right, is on the checkpoint quiz test, they scored higher on exam 1 than students over here to the left. That's what we already showed. Similarly, the students that were high in self-efficacy, so here, the high efficacy students that did well on the exam, they scored really well on the exam. They scored higher than the students that were high self-efficacy, but scored low on the checkpoint quizzes. Similarly, students that were low on self-efficacy, but high on checkpoint quiz scored higher on the exam than those that were low on both. But notice here in the middle, this is what's important. Students that were relatively poor in their performance on the checkpoint quizzes, but who had high self-efficacy, they did as well on the exam than students who did well on the checkpoint quizzes, but didn't have self-efficacy. That shows that it's not just how well you performed. It's what you believe about your skill. And so this result here in the middle, Catherine should be nodding because we've seen this, 24 times in courses that we've examined this effect. Students that are relatively low in their performance, but who have high efficacy, actually score about the same that people who are higher, in this case on the checkpoint quizzes, but have low efficacy. All right. So what I want to do is end with just mentioning a couple ideas that we have regarding future directions, and they all revolve around doing in vivo experiments. And all we mean by in vivo is these aren't going to be lab experiments. These are going to be experiments that we do within the Student Cognition Toolbox that's administered to students wherever. All right. One set of experiments has to do, I mentioned this, I alluded to it anyway yesterday, about embedded prompts. For people that use OLI courses, like intro psych or statistics or chemistry, the intro chemistry, or Spanish, whatever it might be, physics, whatever the course might be, is that one version we can do is some students could do the Student Cognition Toolbox at the beginning of the course, just like we do now, and then do their course in chemistry or statistics or whatever. And along the way, the teacher can say, be sure to use those study strategies you doing it. But one version we have in mind is to have another version of the course in which there are going to be pop-up prompts that show up in the OLI material. So for example, when in the statistical reasoning course, when they get to histograms and how to solve or calculate histograms, a pop-up might come up that says, which of the techniques you learned about might be applicable here? All right. And then have students write some things. So in other words, to get them connected between what we were doing. So we're going to look at that. Another is we're going to think about, we might even contact Mark McDaniel about this, is to do a test of the McDaniel-Einstein model as a causal model, if you know about causal modeling and statistical analysis. And then finally, not finally, but last on this list, is utility value manipulation. There's a pretty robust research literature in social psychology, much of it done in ed psych, that shows, it relates to if students believe that what they're learning is going to be of value to them, they will perform better than if they don't get that manipulation. So what we're going to do is within an embedded course is that some students might do the Student Cognition Toolbox just the way they do now, but others at the beginning, before they do anything, well, after they do the SBI, we're going to have them write a little paragraph, and there's standard ways you do this in this research literature, a standard paragraph, to write a paragraph or two about, you're going to be learning about, tried and true and tested principles about how to study, how important it is going to be to you to learn those techniques so you can apply them in your course. What research has shown is if students just write about that versus a control condition, on the actual assessments, they'll do better. So we're going to actually do some manipulations regarding that. And then finally, with concluding, I mean, I've been sort of concluding all along the way in the sense of saying our purpose in doing these initial analyses is to establish the face validity and the internal validity of the Student Cognition Toolbox. And I think that that's what the results have shown. I mean, virtually all of the analyses we've done, not just those that I've shown you here, but really a dozen other kinds of analysis, all behave the way you would expect them to behave if the tool was valid. It doesn't prove or establish that it's valid, that there's a causal connection between learning this good stuff and then actually doing better. In fact, what Mark and Giles' research article theory shows, that unless you have all the components along the way, you gotta know the stuff, you gotta believe the stuff, you gotta be committed to the stuff, you gotta have a plan. That all of those things are necessary, and we think that the toolbox has that included. So that's it.
Thank you, Victor.
Questions?
Yeah, any questions? Lots of hand claps. I have at least one question. Wondered if you're finding any differences between subject matter at all. I mean, I just was curious about that.
Yeah, okay, great question. Now, so subject matter, so what you're referring to there, Aaron, is that in the Student Cognition Toolbox, in part 1, they, like in the default, they read about material from introductory psychology and then practice the technique. So, and then, so we did our default, what we call our default, with intro psych, because introductory psychology is a course that probably most students take in college. We didn't want to pick nuclear physics, you know, for example, right? So that's that. Right now, we have one other module that's ready to be deployed. And we're going to do our pilot test on it this spring. Again, like we've been doing so far within UNH on that one. We hope to deploy the intro, the default one, on OLI in the spring. So we don't have data yet on other content. We'll have intro. We're also working on chemistry. We're working on biology, and we're thinking about anatomy and physiology. So hopefully, you know, by maybe the end of the spring semester, we might, well, we already have one, but we might have 3 other contents. Then what we'll see is, does it matter, right? So, so it matters in terms of the content of the OLI. The other way the content could matter is the subject matter of the course in which they're enrolled, right? So we don't have it up here today, but they showed it yesterday. What would you show? About 15 of them, Catherine? About 15 of them, you know, Spanish and chemistry and psychology and biology and genetics, and I mean, lots and lots and lots of them. Is that I just showed 2, intro and biology. They show exactly the same thing. Right. I have other analyses. We have other analyses. And, you know, if we get a big enough enrollment, and of course we can do these fancy statistics, they show the same thing. So in that regard, we do know something about content, the content of the course they're enrolled, not the content of the SCT section 1. I haven't noticed anything any different. Sometimes in some classes, the effects are bigger than others, but usually that has to do with the N. You know, that was actually one of the things I wanted to say. I plan to say it somewhere in the middle here, that, you know, that our team, and when we have team meetings, we often sit around and say that this amazes us. And the thing that I'm referring to that amazes us is, it amazes us that we get the results that we do. Meaning, there's so much frickin' noise. I don't mean the noise in the room when somebody's Zooming or whatever. I mean the statistical noise. Is that, you know, students may be, well, there may be a lot of noise when they're working on it. They may be working it in their dorm room. They may be some of those students that close their eyes and click the buttons, right? In other words, there's so much going on, none of which is under our control. One of the reasons I'm an experimental psychologist is I hate that kind of noise, right? And I want to have strong experimental control in the lab, but in fact, in the real world, there's noise everywhere. So it kind of amazes us. It doesn't make any difference which course it's in. It doesn't.
That's great. That's great. I'm really interested in the self-efficacy measure too, and how much of an impact it has. So, you know, the combination of self-efficacy, I don't know, training or information along with the Student Cognition Toolbox seems like it would just, you know, help students so much, you know, even exponentially maybe.
Yeah,
by combining those.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, if you know, if we hang around long enough, you know, to keep doing lots of good work, is that the numbers of ideas for experiments so on. But one of the things that we hope happens is, as we get more experimental, you know, causative evidence, that we'll be able to write something because we're not going to be doing experiments on this forever. I mean, we hope it becomes a tool that's used. I mean, and it gets updated and so on. And because it's on OLI, others can take it and adapt it themselves, right? I mean, that's one of the beauties of it, is that that we'll be able to write something to students about, for example, our work shows this about self-efficacy, and here are ways that you can boost your self-efficacy, and so on. But I mean, Catherine's head is full right now about, I mean, we've done.
I just want to say about self-efficacy. We've been working
Yes.
on this for over a decade, as Victor said. And one of our premises about self-efficacy is, of course, we want to boost self-efficacy because we've shown time and time again that students who have higher self-efficacy, regardless of their actual ability, perform better. And so we believe that in order to build self-efficacy, we have to allow for incremental successes of the students. And so as students see themselves succeeding, their self-efficacy elevates corresponding to their successes. And so our strong belief is that if we give them the tools to succeed, that is the Student Cognition Toolbox, and we show them the many ways that studying in this manner can help, that we will help to build their own self-efficacy, and over time they will begin to succeed and they will develop that higher level. So that's the premise behind the Student Cognition Toolbox, and how we've worked for years is to give them the tools to succeed. When they succeed, they feel better, they feel like they feel more confident they can succeed in these other tasks. One of the main challenges with lower self-efficacy is that students, when they encounter difficulties, they give up, they don't persevere. And so we want to show students that you can persevere and you can succeed if you follow along with the guidance that's given to you by the Student Cognition Toolbox.
Yeah, Van Der, again, who originated this idea, a lot of his early work was on perseverance or perseverance, and as Catherine said, is that's one of the strongest outcomes that occur, and of course, and it mediates success, right? I mean, obviously, if you persevere longer, especially if you're doing the good stuff, right, then you'll see in fact, so you can think of a study within the Student Cognition Toolbox is that students who score high on learning the material and who have interventions to lead to perseverance will actually perform even higher on the high stakes exams within their course. So there are lots of, this is one, again, another one of the beauties is, other people out there, they'll have their own ideas for experiments. They can do them. They can make, and even within the cognition toolbox or as external manipulations, is embed them into their own courses as they, for those people that are interested in doing such things. So
I
Yeah.
just wanted to add that I think it's a really unique combination to look not only at self-efficacy, but test anxiety and need for cognition, because obviously if you have high test anxiety, that can interfere with your success regardless of your belief that you can do well, because test anxiety is a huge obstacle. Or if you have really high need for cognition, you could see that might kind of overcome some other obstacles. So I think this unique suite of 3 different measures is also going to allow us to tease apart certain aspects of the student's human condition that we would otherwise not be privy to with just looking at the data in isolation. So I just wanted to bring those other 2 up as we think about.
Yeah, and we started in last spring, if I'm correct. Last spring we started with this need for cognition measure of Cacioppo and Petty, and we didn't focus on that here. Just as we ran out of time anyway. So there are lots of other. We could redo the talk. We'll re-meet at 1 o'clock. I'm just kidding.
I had a question, but you answered them. With those kids that score high in efficacy, but then score low in the quizzes,
Yes.
is that because of a shallow type of studying that they do? I don't remember if you mentioned that.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't mention it, and I'm not sure. Maybe somewhere we actually have an analysis that addresses that specifically. But you know what might be going on there is that overall you expect that people that do relatively better on academic measures like the checkpoint quizzes will do better on our dependent variables. I mean, that's kind of the standard thing. The power of Bandura's concept is and the way we've actually done studies on this ourselves, is we control for their academic ability. So for example, we could break students up into relatively low, moderate, high SAT scores, and like 3 groupings, for example, and then use high stakes exams in the course as the dependent variable. And you see this, big difference. That is, the high SAT people score higher than the moderate, and the moderate thing. And we've got dozens of studies that show that in all kinds of areas, no question. But at each level of SAT, the students who believe that they can do it, even they're not as skilled, they do better on the exam. And I mean, I showed one version of that with the two mean, those two means right in the middle, where the low checkpoint quiz people, but who are high efficacy, they do as well as the high checkpoint people who have low. So this is sort of the social behavior, personal perception kind of dimension. It comes out of social psychology about self-perception. So one's beliefs about oneself can have a huge, powerful impact independent of performance, because what they show is that each level of academic skill, the high believers do better. And this is not like, I believe that if I just believe my drug for cancer is going to cure me. No. This is not about that. I mean, it actually improves, this belief improves your performance. And
yeah, I'm asking because I have students that say I was so confident that I learned my material, but now my grade is so bad. And so that's why I was asking, maybe it's the technique that they use for studying that is failing them.
Yeah, there's, in fact, it goes well beyond the Student Cognition Toolbox. We actually have data about if students enter an exam being highly confident, self-efficacy confident, and then they bomb the exam. It shows causation, is their self-efficacy drops. So in other words, it's not like it's not a trait. It's not like it's just a trait. They're high efficacy, it is a trait. There are optimistic people and there are highly confident people and so on. But what happens in context, I mean, again, this is what experimental social psychology is about, the power of the situation.
Maybe anxiety?
Yeah.
Maybe anxiety?
Gloria, also, if the way that they're studying is rereading their notes and rereading the textbook, that inflates their false sense of security. So that actually can lead to a false sense of knowing, which is something that we actually caution students against in the Student Cognition Toolbox in multiple nodules. So that's one of the reasons that rereading your notes and the textbook is so dangerous. It leads to an inflated false sense of security that you know the information, but they haven't actually put themselves through the paces of doing any test quizzing or self-explaining the material.
Yeah.
Good
and
point.
Before I forget, I had another question about the quizzes. So I'm giving quizzes every Monday. It's sort of a checkpoint quiz, but I give 24 hours for them to do the quiz. How do you do yours?
Yeah, these the checkpoint quizzes, within the Student Cognition Toolbox, those are taken by the students when they're ready to do it.
Okay.
Module. Remember, we give them a period of time, say maybe up to 2 weeks, whatever it is, to complete the Student Cognition Toolbox. And they're really at their own. Lauren does some reminders and prompts, the window is going to close on Friday and so on. As far as the exams go, I mean, that's going to vary all over the place, right? With like, for example, last spring, I think, all of the exam ones were done before spring break, and after spring break, students didn't come back. So all of exam 2 was done online. Now, we haven't systematically looked at, but I didn't report it here, but those biology analyses where it was exam 1, we have an exam 2 for those students as well, which was, again, after the SCT, but online. So it's all over the place, and how much time is given and so on. And this is, when we work with, Lauren works with faculty, and Catherine with faculty about setting up some of our in vivo experiments, which we're doing unrelated to the SCT all the time, is that it varies, right? It's all over the place on.
And regarding the self-quizzing, are the students preparing the questions for themselves? Because I do have what I call test yourself, and it's sort of a little exam with points, and they go over and then they grade themselves. So I give them a rubric, but I do it. I make the questions. So what you do is something that they interrogate themselves, or you put the quiz, or is this quiz that we're talking about?
It's generated by us.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, by the way, it's creating your own quiz questions can be a very effective technique. In other words, creating your own quiz questions and then, developing flashcards or whatever and self-testing can be very effective, or creating questions, sharing them with study partners. But it really depends on how good the questions are.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I was.
So you could be asking stuff and answering stuff just like that, and then you get the real exam, and it's like bonk, because you screwed it up, right? You didn't.
Yeah.
So
The
self-testing, that's one reason why having study partners is good. In fact, there's some research on quizzing in groups, which provide checks and balances, and there's actually some evidence. We had a talk at the psychology department last year at UNH of someone on this, is that quizzing each other in study groups compared to taking the same quizzes on your own, that the students, when they take an exam on their own, do better when they were quizzing each other in groups than when they did the quizzing on their own. And I think that has to do with the kind of feedback. That is, one person might not know all the stuff, or have the explanation for why that's wrong and so on, but usually collectively, you can get a better take on things. So
Thank you.
I think it also might have to do with the variety of questions, because in our work with faculty and developing these kinds of quiz questions, we've worked with faculty on developing flashcard questions. For example, we work with them to, first of all, determine what are their learning goals, their learning objectives, what do they want students to know. And so we develop flashcard questions based on what the teachers want them to know, and also based on what they're going to be asking on the exam, because retrieval practice works insofar as you have transfer questions on the exam that are related to the quiz questions. And so sometimes whenever students ask themselves questions, which isn't a bad thing, it's just that they might be asking the wrong kind of questions, or it might be in their interpretation of what's important, rather than what the teacher thinks is important. So there are pluses and minuses, and I think what Victor is talking about, working in groups, the advantage of that is that you have a variety of students who ask a variety of questions, and it's bound that at least some of those questions might show up on the exam, where if the student's just asking their own quiz questions, they might not. So, so it's really important to know,
Yeah.
have some idea of what's going to be on the exam in terms of
Yeah.
how the questions
And not all study groups are created equal, right? Is that it depends on how they're structured, and so having instructions, just like going over, for example, what you're talking about, Catherine, right, is really important. But yeah, it can be very powerful technique.
One of the things that I found when I was teaching genetics to students is that even when they're told that exams will feature application questions and that they should be studying application type questions, problem solving questions that will feature on the exam, sometimes they would do very poorly on the exam, even given very similar application type questions. So even if your quiz questions are similar to your exam questions in that they also ask students to do a application, sometimes there seems to be a barrier between students practicing that and understanding the importance of that, and that it will be featured on their exam.
Yeah.
So I think the only real way to succeed through pushing students through that barrier is just kind of like nailing it into them over and over that application will be on the exam. And that's something that definitely would be largely featured in chemistry.
Yeah. And our table of specifications, no, wait, what do we call it? Our table.
Study strategy selection.
Study strategy selection table. There you go. That's really the part of the rationale of why we developed that tool the way we did, so that people understand the linkage between here's how you're studying and here's how you're going to be assessed. And yeah, it's a good point. So.
Well, thank you guys so much for sharing your important work. Catherine, Lauren, Victor, I'm really excited to release the toolkit, the Student Cognition Toolkit, and get more people using it. And it sounds like it's going to be so very useful. So thank you for coming and sharing all of the great information that you have about the toolkit and the studies. And we'll look forward to working more with you, and I'll look forward to more of those experiments that you're going to be doing.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting, to learning how to do that, right? Another set of skills, right?
Yeah.
How do you create those?
Thank you for inviting us and being so welcoming to our presentation. We really appreciate that.
Of course.
Yes,
Thank you. It was very useful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice meeting
To
you, Gloria.
everyone who came.
Nice meeting you too.
Bye.